let's get into the meat of the topic with our special guest, Dr. Krishona Martinson. And so tonight, she will be talking about the physical evaluation of hay and reducing waste. And so I have known Dr. Martinson for a lot of years. I don't know how many, way too many, probably longer than a lot of you have been alive. And been a friend and a colleague for years. And she has a unique background of both plants and horses. So she just brings a wealth of information to us. And then of course, later on, we'll have Ashley Jeffer Samples, who, if you've been around, you've seen her from Greenlee County. She's 4-H and FCHS, but tonight 4-H agent in Greenlee, and she'll be finishing up the webinar with the 4-H. So most of you guys, if this is not your first meeting, you have seen the rules, webinar etiquette. All participants, as you know, are muted with no camera, since this is a learning experience within a short time frame, and it's a webinar form of Zoom. So you have two options. We do not do the hands raising. We can either type questions in the question and answer section, which if you roll your mouse over the bottom of your screen, the menu should pop up. Or if something's just like, hey, where are you from, and that kind of stuff, that kind of information can go in the chat. And of course, we want to keep the chat to the topic, because this is short time for a lot of information. And questions will be addressed at the appropriate time. So if it's not addressed right away, then it'll probably be caught at the end. But if there's something pertinent, then either myself or my other question wrangler, Ashley Wright, our area livestock agent, will also pipe in. All right, polite and respectful. Recording will be available later. Both the chicken and the beef recordings are now uploaded. And if anyone's harassing anyone or acting inappropriate, you're gone. But we haven't had that problem, so that's awesome. And of course, you know, earn and learn, Ag at Home t-shirt. If you attend 5 or more of these webinar series live, then you can earn a free t-shirt. And so then anyone from the beginning, we have 1 qualified so far, and several of you will probably be qualified after tonight. So after the series, the registered attendees will receive an overall survey. And if you've checked off those, we'll get a size and a mailing address. And so after that, we'll order the shirt so that you can get exactly the size that you want. And so from there, I am going to stop share, and I will turn it over to Dr. Martinson, and she will share her screen, and we will get on with our topic.
All right, thank you, Dr. Green. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, and feel free to interrupt me if needed throughout the presentation. I don't need to take the questions at the end, whatever works best. Okay. So today I'm super excited to talk about the physical evaluation of hay and reducing hay waste. So like Dr. Green said, oops, let's see here. So as Dr. Green said, my background is in agronomy. So I have a crops background, and because of that, my research program focuses on forages, whether that's hay or pasture. And on a practical standpoint, my daughters and I do speed events. So you can just see some of our horses here. So this is what we enjoy doing with our horses as well. So here's an outline of what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about the physical evaluation of hay, what to look for in that hay. We're going to talk about some research we did on using slow feed hay nets, and then also some research we've done on reducing hay waste when feeding small square bales and also large round bales. So physical evaluation of hay. So this is what you look for. I don't know how many of you, when you buy hay, if you have the opportunity to break open a bale before you buy a larger lot, or at least, look through the hay as much as you can. And we're going to get into details on these, but you really need to know what is in the hay. whether it is a cool season grass. I know down here in Arizona, I see a lot of alfalfa. There is, your Bermuda grass. I see teff grass. I see ryegrass. And you also, so you want to know kind of what's prevalent in your area, so you can tell, should that species be in the hay? So we're trying to eliminate weeds and identify what's in the hay. We want to look at maturity. Of course, we're always interested in the touch, the smell, the color. And then of course, we have zero tolerance for any mold or toxic plants. Excuse me. So again, we're going to get into these, but really these are the 6 things that I think all horse owners should really look for when you're evaluating horse hay. So why is it important to know what is in the hay? And of course, we'll talk more about weeds in a minute, but there are really major differences between the nutritive values of the different species of hay. So warm season grasses, that would be like your teff grass, your Bermuda grass, legumes like alfalfa, and then of course your cool season grasses. And I know here in Arizona, those are not as prevalent, but I have seen some ryegrasses in Arizona. So why do we care about this? Why do we care what kind of species is in the hay? Well, in general, warm season grasses, again, these is your teff and your Bermuda grass, they tend to be higher in fiber values, lower in crude protein, lower in non-structural carbohydrates, lower in calcium, and lower in digestible energy. It doesn't mean that they're bad hays. It just means that you'd want to match this hay type with your horse. So for example, if you have a horse that maybe is slightly overweight, because warm season grasses tend to be lower in digestible energy, they tend to be a good fit for these horses. Because these grasses tend to be lower in non-structural carbohydrates. If you have a horse that has metabolic syndrome or has laminitis, these tend to be good options. Now compare that to legumes. Legumes tend to be lower in fiber, and fiber really helps us estimate or kind of evaluate how available the nutrients are and how readily or how quickly the horses will eat the hay. So usually that nice leafy alfalfa they can consume really quickly because it's lower in fiber. It is higher in crude protein. It is actually moderate in non-structural carbohydrates, higher in calcium, and higher in digestible energy. And legumes, hay that is predominantly legumes, tends to be better suited for those horses that have higher energy needs. So performance horses, maybe brood mares in their final month of pregnancy or an early lactation, or breeding stallion, something that has a higher energy need. And then again, the cool season grasses, which I know we have people from all over the country, and especially those of you, I heard Dr. Green say some people from the East Coast, that's where your cool season grasses are really common. So examples of cool season grasses are your ryegrasses, your timothy, your orchard grass, your brome grass. Those are our cool season grasses. They tend to be moderate in fiber, moderate in crude protein. They are highest in non-structural carbohydrates, a little bit lower in calcium, and moderate in digestible energy. And I think cool season grasses can be fed to a diversity of horses because they're really easy to feed, right? The only concern I have with cool season grasses is because they tend to be quite high in non-structural carbohydrates, or they can be quite high. If a horse has metabolic syndrome or is prone to laminitis, I want to use caution in how much cool season grasses I feed. Now, most people will probably feed a mix of these. Very few of you probably feed pure legumes or pure cool season or pure warm season. You're probably mixing and matching to meet your horse's needs. But again, it's really important to me, I think in my impression, to know what is in the hay. Again, just because there are these major differences between these main forage types that we feed to horses. And Dr. Green, I promise I will stop in a little bit to ask questions on this section. So the other thing that is really important is maturity. And when we're looking at grasses, How we can tell if something is more mature is we can look for seed heads, or we can look for the size of the stem. The more seed heads and the bigger the stem, the more mature the hay is. With legumes, we look for flowers and stems. The more flowers and the bigger the stems, the more mature the hay is. Now, more mature hay doesn't mean it's bad, but if you look at this little figure right here, and I think I can find my pointer, I don't know if you can see that, but if you look at the figure on your lower left-hand side, you can see it's vegetative up to post-flower. So as we move along, the plant is getting more mature. We are getting more yield or more volume, but because we are getting more stem, because as that plant gets bigger, it needs to have a larger stem so that that stem can hold up the plant. That is why a more mature plant will have a greater stem. The problem is, as we get more stems, we tend to get lesser, the proportion of leaf to stem is increased, so we have less leaves, and our forage digestibility and our nutrients tend to go down. So a more mature forage, whether it's warm season, cool season, or a legume, will be less energy dense than an immature plant. And that is important because if you have a horse that is just hanging out, maybe an easy keeper, maybe that retired horse that you're lucky it can maintain its weight well, you really want a mature hay for that horse. Now, if you have an equine athlete that requires a lot of calories and a lot of energy, you're going to want a less mature hay. Also, more mature hays tend to be higher in fiber, and that slows the horse down. I have some horses that are Hoover horses. A Hoover horse is you give them a quantity of hay and you feel like you turn your back and you turn around and it is gone. They Hoover it up. These more mature hays can sometimes slow them down. So again, it doesn't mean that it's good or bad, because I truly believe that if you had 5 horses, you could pick 5 different hays that would match each horse specifically. I realize that isn't practical, right? Especially in a large boarding or barn facility situation, but all of these hays have a place. You just have to match the hay with your horse's need, and maturity is a key thing to look at. So the one thing people always say to me is, I want beautiful green hay. Well, I agree. Beautiful green hay makes us feel good. It looks pretty, right? It visually is appealing. But in my opinion, color isn't as critical, because as you can see here from this picture, and I've seen a lot of hay that has been stored, that is stored outside or under one roof, right? That outside edge will become bleached. So don't put too much, just don't put too many eggs in your basket when it comes to color. Color to me is not critical. A little bit of bleaching just could indicate that you maybe had a little bit of rainfall on that hay, or maybe a heavy dew, or maybe it's just bleaching from the sun. Faded hay does tend to be a little bit lower in minerals, but all horses that are being fed a primarily hay diet or pure hay diet should be on a ration balancer or a vitamin mineral mix, because even your best quality, most green, most beautiful hay is going to be deficient in some vitamins and minerals. It's just the way it is. So if your horse is on a primarily hay diet, it needs to also be getting some kind of a ration balancer, a vitamin and mineral mix, or perhaps you're feeding a grain product according to the labeled instructions. So again, don't get too hung up on color. Faded hay is fine, especially if you can peel back that layer and it's nice and green right beyond that. Now, of course, if the hay is brown or black, stay away from it. I'm just talking about hay that isn't quite bright green, but is still greenish. So greenish hay is just fine in my opinion. And the reason I also don't get too hung up on color is this picture on the left-hand side here. This was a perfectly green bale of hay that somebody brought into our veterinary clinic at the University of Minnesota, and their horses wouldn't eat it and they had some other issues. Well, this bale of hay was green, but what color are weeds? Weeds are green. I know you're all sitting in your living room saying, weeds are green. fine. So of course, that is why you need to know what is in the hay along with these other physical characteristics. So of course, when we're looking at horse hay, we have 0 tolerance for toxic plants. I don't know the toxic plants that you have down here in the southwestern part of the US, but up in the Midwest and over to the east, we have 0 tolerance for the hemlocks, for Horiolisum, for those types of plants that are very toxic to horses. And so this bale on your left-hand side was nothing but weeds, but it was green. It also had foxtail, and that is, I think foxtail is probably prevalent across the whole US. And that can cause little mouth ulcers as those little awns that are in the seed heads become embedded in the mouth. So again, 0 tolerance of any toxic plant for the horse. If you have other weeds that are not toxic to the horse, we maybe have a 10% tolerance because it is very hard to have a perfectly clean hayfield. So again, we can tolerate a few non-toxic plants, but of course we have a 0 tolerance for anything that is toxic. And the final thing I want to touch on in the physical evaluation, and then I will stop to take some questions here, is just the mold. So here you can see on the right-hand side, you can see a bale, and you guys know what the mold looks like, right? Like when you pull those flakes apart, they're kind of like melted together. And when you pull them apart, you can see a poof of little white mold dust comes out, or it smells bad, or you can just sense that something is off. But a lot of times mold is directly related to the moisture at which the hay was baled. We know that anytime hay is baled at greater than 15 to 17% moisture, depending on the physical bale size, whether it's a small square bale or a large round bale, our chance of molding increases dramatically. And again, we can tell, by the way, sometimes those bales are super heavy, or when we pull those flakes apart, they just don't quite come apart right. Interestingly enough, in the horse industry, we have taken some guidelines from the cattle industry. So this table I have here has been taken from Penn State, and we've adapted it to horses. So wherever you're at, whether in your living room, sitting out on your patio, sitting outside, there is mold in the air. It's just the environment that we live in. Any feed that is designated for horse feed, we want it to have less than 500,000 colony forming units of mold. Now that sounds like a lot, but you can barely start to smell the mold at that rate. So any feed, whether it's hay, any other kind of feed stuff you're feeding to a horse, we want that feed stuff to have less than 500,000 colony forming units of mold. Cattle can go up to 1 million, but horses just have too sensitive of a respiratory tract to be able to tolerate any mold. And then you can see anything over 1 million, we just cannot feed. And really anything over 500,000, we cannot feed to horses. Now you can, if you are suspicious of your hay, you can send it out for a laboratory and they will send you back colony forming units of the mold. So you will have an idea of how much mold is in your hay if you are suspicious. But if you can start to smell it and you can feel the heat or those flakes are stuck together, you're probably already over 500,000 colony forming units of mold. So with that, Dr. Green and Ashley, I think I can kind of see questions, but I don't know what they are. I'm happy to take any that pertain to what I've been talking about.
Sure. So in the chat, actually, I asked Ashley to list some of our weeds and toxic weeds. And
oh, perfect.
Around here, we have burrowweed, snakeweed, locoweed, and oleander, which is used a lot in landscaping. Back to some of the content of hay. How much sugar and calcium is in alfalfa hay?
So that's a great question. Before I get to that, Ashley, I want to tell you that local weed, the main symptom of local weed is aimless wandering. I love that symptom, right? Like sometimes I feel like I'm just aimlessly wandering around. So back to the question of the amount of non-structural carbohydrates and calcium in alfalfa. So usually So first of all, just kind of something to think about. For a healthy horse, we have no upper limits of non-structural carbohydrates, right? We actually want to maximize that because that's the horse's fuel. For horses I want you all to know that horses need non-structural carbohydrates, even ones with diseases. The horses where we're concerned about non-structural carbohydrates are horses with laminitis, horses with PPID, equine metabolic syndrome, polysaccharide storage myopathy, and we kind of group horses that are obese into that category too, because that obesity tends to trigger other issues. Most of those horses, we want to keep their entire diet less than 12% non-structural carbohydrates, and horses with PSSM about 10. Remember, that's their entire diet. So any grain, any mineral, any supplements, any treats, any hay. And because forage tends to be the biggest part of their diet, we tend to focus on forage. Alfalfa up in our research area, and Ashley, please, if you have values for your alfalfa down here, in the Midwest, our alfalfa will run right around 12% non-structural carbohydrates. Our cool season grasses tend to run closer to 14% non-structural carbohydrates. And our warm season grasses, and the only warm season grass we can grow in Minnesota is teff, which is an annual. That tends to be between 8 and 10%. So Ashley, before we move on to calcium, is that about, and Dr. Green, is that about what you guys see in your alfalfa?
That's pretty similar. We do have a tendency to see some really hot, for lack of a better word, alfalfa here with higher protein and stuff. But typically that goes straight to the dairy industries because we do grow a lot of alfalfa for dairy. And then we see that sort of more mid-level stuff for the horse industry, for sure.
Yeah, and somebody also kind of the same parallel universe asking about non-structural carbohydrates, why they're important, and when we are looking at nutrition needs of the horse. So I think you probably kind of hit that one.
So
that's
sorry, Dr. Green.
PPID. What was it used to be known as?
Yeah, so PPID used to be known as equine Cushing's. But now it's PPID, which is pituitary pars intermediate disorder, something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I guess that just because it is a more accurate way to classify PPID in horses, because it isn't quite, from what I understand, it's not quite the same as what they see in humans and dogs, for example. But I promise I'll get to the calcium. I haven't forgot that question. But on the non-structural carbohydrates, just to review, that's the fuel for the horse's engine. So this horse pictured here, that is a speed event horse. Because this horse is healthy, there's no disorders, I want to maximize the amount of non-structural carbohydrates. Now, we do have to be careful in how much we feed in one setting if we are feeding a lot of grain. And Dr. Green, I don't know those requirements off the top of my head, but there are limits to the amount of starch, and which is part of non-structural carbohydrates that you can feed at one meal. But when it comes to forages, there's very few forages that have too much non-structural carbohydrates for a healthy horse. And again, we just want to restrict those non-structural carbohydrates for a horse that has a history or is currently having a laminitic episode, has equine metabolic syndrome, has PPID, is obese, or has polysaccharide storage myopathy or PSSM. So Betsy, before we get off the non-structural carbohydrate thought, is there anything else, any other questions that are kind of similar to that nature?
It looks like that's covered most of that. A quick interesting one that I can actually comment on too is the horse owner in Missouri told me they believe alfalfa is for cattle, not horses. She said grass hay was their hay of choice, not alfalfa. And I can tell you, growing up in Massachusetts and being in Kentucky, Arizona, Washington, and Vermont, and Kansas, that if you're on the East Coast, then alfalfa is the devil and should never be fed to horses unless they're race horses, they feed it. But if you're out west, if you're in Washington, the Timothy gets compacted and sent to foreign countries at a very high price. So you feed alfalfa. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's what you have available and what grows.
And, you know, I'm a firm believer. You have to do what works best for you and your horse. So, you know, I'm in Minnesota. We're lucky we can grow a lot of different forages, high quality forages. For my performance horses, I like the alfalfa because I don't want to rely so much on cereal grains. And I want energy
You're freezing up
and
a
just to keep the muscle and the condition on my horses.
Okay, so you're a little frozen up, but I think
Am
we
I
got you
back, Dr. Green?
I think
Okay, I
you're a
hope
little
I'm back.
frozen, but I think we got you.
Okay, I hope I'm back.
Yes, you are.
I hope. Okay, good. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No. Hey, hey, it's our Arizona network that's the problem.
That's right.
Visiting us.
Yes, that's right. That is right.
Okay, so I don't know. Can you see the questions you got?
No, but I want to. So when it comes to calcium, we look more at the calcium to phosphorus ratio, and with alfalfa, we do see. So the recommended calcium to phosphorus ratio is 2 to 1. But there's a pretty big range of 1 to 1 up to 6 to 1. With alfalfa, we generally tend to see about 4 to 1, so more calcium. With the grasses, both the warm season and cool season, we're generally closer to 1 to 1. So you're okay.
Okay, so what when you get your hay bales from the feed store? So you're buying what you can fit in the back of your truck.
Mm-hmm.
How do you tell about quality? I mean, you can't just test not a big bunch.
No.
It's kind of.
Yeah. So if you're buying small lots of hay, it is not practical to have it tested. You just really have to rely on how your horses are looking and acting, and also just the physical parameters of the hay. So that is where you're going to have to kind of take your little hands and get in there as much as you can and look for smaller stems, you know, or, I mean, match it to your horse. If you have a performance horse, look for hay that's a little bit more green, is finer stemmed, is more leafy. If you're feeding an overweight horse or super easy keeper, look for bigger stems, look for hay that's a little bit faded, right? You just have to use your best guesses. We also have a YouTube video on evaluating horse hay, as I'm sure many other universities have as well, but that kind of goes over some of the different things that I just went over very briefly.
Is that something that I can hunt down while you're talking later?
And put in the chat. Absolutely, Dr. Green. University of Minnesota evaluating horse hay.
Okay, perfect.
yeah.
So can horses only have hay, or can they have other stuff like total equine?
I don't, is total equine, like, tell me more about what that is.
I'm not exactly sure, but I know that we often have a lot of people that feed hay and the hay pellets and hay cubes.
Oh, sure.
And then
Yep.
complete hay pellets
Yeah.
actually have the more than just the hay.
So, sorry. So there are actually a lot of hay replacements that work well that are sold in bags. Some of those, like for senior horses, tend to work really well and can be fed as a complete diet replacement. A lot of things like hay cubes or hay biscuits or chaff or other things, or hay extenders, usually aren't recommended to be fed as the sole part. And the reason is horses have a requirement for long stemmed forage. So long stem forage is coming in the form of hay or pasture. But when you have hay cubes or hay biscuits or that chaff, it has been chopped and the forage isn't long. So you can maybe use it as 25% of the diet, or maybe even 50% for the short term if you're traveling or if there's a drought or some kind of a disaster. But you really do want the horses to have some access to that long stem forage, with the only exception being that really senior horse that has no teeth left, where they cannot chew that long stem forage. Then some of those total senior replacement products work very well, and that is what they're designed to do. And Dr. Green, you know just about as much as this as I do, so feel free to add in.
No, you're doing great. There is a comment about, are you familiar with blister beetles and alfalfa hay?
Yeah.
And because I want to make sure that you get through your stuff, we do have an article that we wrote that we will put that link in the chat. And so you can become familiar too. I want to know, probably we could go ahead and continue and then get questions afterwards.
Yeah, that sounds good. Perfect, because I have a couple more. I just have a few more kind of topics, and then we can take more questions. But yes,
Perfect.
Dr. Green, we are very lucky that, you know, in the upper part of the country, we don't have as many issues with blister beetles as you guys maybe have down here. But I know that you guys have a good article because I have used that article. So
excellent. We'll put that in the chat.
thanks.
Oh, it's in the chat.
All right. Perfect. So going on to some of the research we've done with slow feed hay nets. If you have been to a horse show or horse facility, I am sure you have seen these slow feed hay nets everywhere. So we did a research project, and I always joke that a lot of what I do is I just put numbers to common sense, right? Like we all know that if a horse is eating out of a really small hold net, of course it's going to slow them down. But until we did this research, we didn't know how much it slowed the horses down. So what we did is we fed adult horses. So they were about 1,000, 1,100 pound horses. And we fed them 1% of their body weight. So 10 to 11 pounds in the morning. And we fed them, we had a control where we just put their allocated hay amount on the stall floor. They were fed indoors in box stalls to keep it easy. Then we had this larger net with the blue string or the blue rope. They had those large 6-inch diamond openings. We had the middle net, which was a medium-sized opening of 1.75 inches. And then we had the small hold or the slow feed hay net, which was 1.25 inches opening. And we simply gave the horses as much time as they wanted to eat their 1% body weight hay meal. Well, actually, I take that back. At first, we only gave them 4 hours because I thought they're going to be able to eat all of their hay in 4 hours, no problem, right? Like 10 pounds of hay, 4 hours. Well, I was wrong. So what we did is we found that when the horses ate from the ground or on the control, or when they ate from that large 6-inch hole, that 6-inch opening, it took up 3.2 to 3.4 hours to eat that 1% body weight hay meal, or that 10 or 11 pound hay meal. Now, interestingly enough, they could not complete their hay meal from the small hold and that medium hold hay net. So what we then did is, after we completed that study, we went back with the same hay, the same horses, the same hay nets, and we gave them an unlimited amount of time. And it took the horses 5.1 hours out of that medium hold net, that 1.75 inches, and 6.5 hours out of the small hold hay net. And why this is important is, if you would allow a horse to graze, or horses in a natural setting, they will graze for anywhere about 14 to 16 hours a day. I know we all think they eat nonstop, but they actually do. They do. I'm getting a little thing that my internet is unstable. Dr. Green, can you still see and hear me?
Yeah, you have a few occasional freeze ups, but you've been coming back real quick.
Okay, all right, just interrupt me. So why this is important is because horses will graze for about 14 to 16 hours a day. They are meant to be trickle grazers, small, frequent meals. And what this does, if we feed out of a slow feed hay net morning and night, we can give them an allocated amount of hay so they don't overeat or become obese, but we can extend their grazing time. So if we double this, we can extend it from 6 hours up to 13 hours. So we can almost mimic that natural grazing by simply using a slow feed hay net. And why this is so important is, I'm sure you all have seen and heard that a lot of performance horses especially tend to be prone to ulcers because they're on the road, they're performing, they're under strict training schedules and strict regimens. And the only time a horse produces that buffered saliva is when they're chewing. So if they're standing for long periods of time in a stall or going long periods of time without chewing, they're more prone to getting these ulcers. So these hay nets, we think, can really help in just simulating that saliva. It gives them something to do, and it keeps these small little meals going through their digestive system. Now, a lot of people think that hay nets are cruel. So this is a separate study we did. We actually did a weight loss study, but during that weight loss study, we measured a number of parameters, and one of them was cortisol. So right here, we can see that this is horses fed off of a net and their cortisol, and horses simply fed off the floor and their cortisol. And these horses were being restricted. So they were being fed 1.5% of their body weight a day because they were on a weight loss regimen. And cortisol is a stress hormone. So look at these horses eating off the net. This is this first image. You can see it is really quite stable. And these arrows just showcase when the horses were fed. Now compare that to the meals much quicker, and they were going much longer in between meals with nothing to eat. So you can see that their cortisol went up, and then it went down when they were eating, then it went back up, and then it kind of stabilized.
So,
Dr. Green, am I frozen?
You were when you were describing the first graph on, then you said as compared to. So what, just tell us the first graph again. Uh-oh, you're smiling, frozen.
The first.
There you are. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'm so sorry. The net cortisol, these are horses that were fed from a slow feed hay net. So you can see that their cortisol is nice and level, nice and even. When you compare it to horses that were fed off the floor, they could consume their hay meal quite quickly. So they consumed it quickly. You see their cortisol went up, it went down as they were eating, and then they had nothing to eat, and then their cortisol shot back up. And we want to see cortisol staying pretty level. So actually, one thing we never anticipated was that the hay nets actually helped maintain a pretty level cortisol amount in the horses, which means that they were less stressed eating out of a hay net. So the other study we have done is looking at the efficiencies of round bale feeders. So here you can see we have something that is called a hay hut. This was a covered cradle feeder with sides. This was just kind of a hay basket. This feeder had these little sides that just kind of gravity flowed and went down as the bale was consumed. Of course, here we had our large hay net. So this was those 1 3/4 inch openings. We had a round bale fed without a feeder. And then we had these circular feeders, which tend to be really common. So this feeder that kind of had a ring on top, this was just your normal ring. This one is a tombstone because these are shaped like tombstone. And this was a tombstone saver, which is a little bit of a different shaped tombstone. And what we did is we had groups of 4 horses that rotated every 4 days through pens that had these feeders in them. And every single day we raked up waste around the feeders. And so we measured the waste, we weighed all the round bales, and we weighed the horses going in and out of the pens. So we knew what everything weighed, we knew how much waste, so we could calculate the economics and the waste that resulted from feeding these round bales. And the reason we did it is people were commonly wanting to feed round bales because they were cheaper and the price per ton compared to small square bales, but they were saying that they couldn't afford a feeder. And we thought to ourselves, like, it just looked like so much waste when you didn't have a feeder. So what we found is the wasteless feeder, that's the one that had the roof and the little sides, and that hay net actually only had 5 and 6% waste. And when you see the numbers here, the letters mean that if they have a letter in common, they were not statistically different. The hay hut, that green one that looked like a kid's playhouse, had 9%. You can see a lot of the circular ones were around 19% waste. But the biggest kicker was when you did not use the feeder, 57% waste. Here you can see the cost of the feeders at the time we did our research. We used hay at $200 a ton. Yes, our hay is very, very affordable up north. I know it's very different depending on where you're located in local supply and demand, but all of these feeders paid for themselves within 10 months. And in fact, the hay net paid for itself in less than a month. So you need, if you're going to feed round bales, you absolutely have to use a feeder. I don't care what feeder, pick the feeder that you like best, but just please use a feeder. So then that was a very popular study, but we followed it up with feeding small square bales because we know a lot of people feed small square bales outdoors. So we use this basket feeder. The middle one was called a porta-grazer. You actually turned it upside down, put that little grate on it, put the bale or the flakes in, and then as the horses ate, that little grate kind of moved down. And then there is just this rack feeder with a bunk. And then of course, we also fed hay on the ground. And these were also small herds of 4 horses in dry lots. And we just fed the hay at 2% of the body weight a day. So 1% in the morning and 1% at night. And what we found is that when we did not use a feeder, even though we were feeding a very small amount, we just weren't putting out bales and bales, we still had 13% waste without a feeder. And then only 1 to 5% waste when we used a feeder. And again, they all paid for themselves within a year. So again, if you're feeding any kind of hay, especially when hay is very valuable in certain parts of the country, you have to use a feeder. Any feeder, just use a feeder. So if we look at the bigger picture of reducing hay waste, there was also a study out of Texas where they fed small square bales inside of a box stall, either on the stall floor or in a feeder. And they had pretty similar waste results that we did when we fed outside with the feeders. So what I have done here is just some math, right? This is the dollar value of wasted hay when we're feeding adult horses with and without a feeder. So if you have 5 horses at home and you are feeding small square bales in a stall with a feeder, you are still going to have some waste, but you are only wasting $56 per year. And that is assuming hay at $250 a ton, and that this hay is really, that this horse is receiving the vast majority of its diet in hay throughout the year. Now, without a feeder, we are wasting $394 a year. Pretty similar values outdoors. And of course, with our large round bales, because we're putting out such a mass amount of hay, if we're using our most efficient feeder with 5% waste, we're only wasting $281 versus $3,200. Now, if we are at a large boarding facility, if we are feeding round bales outdoors, even with a feeder, we have some waste, we know that. But if you are not using a feeder, it is $32,000 of hay waste. That buys a lot of stuff, a lot of hay feeders. So this slide just kind of brings home the importance of using a hay feeder based on research-based values. Excuse me. So we'll get to questions, and Betsy, we should have time. We have lots of resources available, as does Arizona. So with that, Betsy, I know you guys have a 4-H kind of overview, and I can take questions at any time.
Okay, so I know that we have Ashley Jeffer Sample on here. I think I actually need to elevate her. So hang on just 1 minute. Okay, Ashley, you are now elevated. So she's going to come back into us. Are you in there? There she is. Okay, so we'll go ahead and just do the
Hey
quick.
there, can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. There you go. So
Okay,
we'll do the
perfect.
4-H horses, and then we will go to all the questions. Ashley Wright and I have answered a couple of the questions, so you don't have 73 anymore. Okay, so Ashley Jeffer Sample is 4-H and Family Consumer Science agent in Greenlee County, and tonight she's 4-H agent. So go for it.
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Betsy, for the introduction. So I'm just going to talk really quick about the Arizona 4-H Horse Project and give you some ideas of maybe some programs that you're not currently doing at the county level that you can add, and just some ideas of ways to kind of expand your horse project. And I'll be fast so we can get down to those questions. So Some ways of expanding is to expand the different disciplines that you offer at the county level. So across the board, Western and English is offered at every county, but here are some of the other things you can think about offering at your county fair, any winter point competition, or maybe you don't want to include it at the fair your first year, but just start bringing in this discipline and understanding the inner workings of it. So that includes ranch horse, sorting, our roping events, our timed events. So that's our barrels and our poles, any sort of the gymkhana type events. We include goat tying in that section. And then think about bringing an educational program in. The example that I wanted to use here is Pima County has a really neat program. It's called jacketing. And I always compare it kind of to like a varsity jacket when you're in high school. And they do an educational component. And youth members have to pass different aspects of this educational component in order to gain their jacket. And so this includes a written test. This includes horse judging, handling, and a lot of different other aspects. So if there's any volunteers or parents on here that are interested in learning more about the jacketing program and the educational aspect of that, feel free to reach out. And then the same goes with these disciplines. If you don't have these disciplines at your county level, but are interested in bringing them to your county competition, the Arizona State 4-H rulebook kind of lines out great rules for you to get started on this project. So we were able to come together and create a cohesive state rulebook last year that's going to be a great guide if you want to introduce any of these disciplines at your county level that you might not already have. And so then moving on to some opportunities that you can go on beyond your discipline, or if you might be a part of the Horseless Horse Project, here's some great opportunities that you don't necessarily have to own a horse to compete in. So horse judging is a great example of that. And there's a lot of different opportunities to compete in horse judging in Arizona. And that includes Arizona National Livestock Show. We also, in the past, Betsy has put on a horse judging clinic and contest, both Phoenix and in Tucson. So there's a lot of great opportunities for horse judging. And that's a skill that's going to help you throughout your whole entire involvement with the equine industry, because once you have the basis of horse judging, it really gives you a leg up. Same for those of you that might be in FFA. That's one of the CED competitions. So it's a great base to get you ready for that. And Betsy went ahead and put the Arizona State 4-H Horse Rulebook in the chat box. So for any of you looking to expand on those disciplines, there's a great resource there. And then some more things we have is a skillathon or hippology, a great way to showcase your knowledge. And that too has a lot of contests that you can hit on a state and national level. We have a cooperative extension 4-H contest that we put on, Arizona Nationals in February. Oh yeah, Betsy did do the horse judging in Tucson a few years back. I don't remember if it was in February or not, but oh no, am I breaking up?
No, you're fine. But that was 2 years in October.
Oh yeah, wow. Oh, it's been 2 years already? Oh my gosh. Yeah, so 2 years ago. And then team grooming is a really great opportunity to show those skills that you already have learned from your career with 4-H or any other horse association. I put Arizona National Livestock Show, and then Betsy always hosts a Southern Arizona Equine Health Symposium that's full of great information and is a great place for not only 4-H members, but parents, volunteers to come and to get some information about what's going on in the horse industry. And then I also put Western National Roundup in here because a lot of these contests like the horse judging and the hippology and even speaking contests on horses will take you to that next level at a national contest. And I think that that's something great to think about. When you hit a collegiate level, there's a lot of different opportunities there as well for those of you that are involved in the horse project. So for any of you that are seniors and plan on attending a university, especially the University of Arizona, and want to stay involved in the horse project, just feel free to reach out and we'll get you some connections there. And then the last thing I wanted to put in here was The extension website for the horse project is a really great resource if you want to just get on there and see if there are any new publications that have to do with equine, if there's any new webinars, or when we're back in person, any competitive events or virtual events. I always like to send people to the extension horse website because there's a lot of great information there. So I think that sums up what I have today about getting involved in 4-H. For any of you that are interested in any of these opportunities that I shared, I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat box, and just feel free to reach out to me, and I would be happy to guide you along.
Thank you very much, Ashley. That's great. And of course, also in Pima County before she went to Greenlee County. And so she had firsthand action with that. It's called the letter jacket too. So great opportunities, whether it's education or competitive. So thank you again, Ashley. And she put her email in the chat, and we put several links in the chat as well. And yes, you guys go to the Eastern National Horse Roundup and out of Maryland, or in Kentucky, but out of Maryland. So some questions. You ready? You're in the dark.
Ready.
It got dark in Buckeye.
It did.
So can you recommend a vitamin mineral mix for old horses?
A vitamin and mineral mix for old horses. So that's a great question. I'm very careful to state that I'm not a nutritionist. I'm a forage specialist. However, most of the major feed companies make wonderful vitamin and mineral mixes that are really do good for any class of adult horse, right? So anything beyond that growing horse. So the vitamin and mineral mixes, the ones that I recommend are the ones that you can readily get, that are located close to you. There's a slight price difference, so maybe do some math. And all of those feed bags have a number you can call to talk to a nutritionist. So that's what I would do. I would find one that is readily available in your area, affordable, and with a major feed company, whether it's a regional company or national company. And in my opinion, they are all excellent. The only time you don't really need a ration balancer or vitamin and mineral mix is if you are feeding like a senior horse feed to the labeled recommendation. And a lot of people don't realize a lot of those recommendations are like 8 to 12 pounds a day. So if you are cutting that in half, you're also cutting the amount of vitamins and minerals that feed is designed to give your senior horse in half. So again, if you are feeding that bagged feed, to the recommended amount, then you wouldn't need it. But otherwise, a lot of those major feed companies are really great. And Dr. Green, feel free to add here too.
Yeah, and of course, both Dr. Martinson and I know that we really, university and extension people can't really make recommendations specific feeds or companies. So often we're talking about contents and labels and things like that, and then you make the best choice. But if it has some magic foo-foo dust in it, probably avoid it. Go for the science-based, consistent, and regulated product. Okay, so a quick or a very simple description of equine metabolic disease.
So the best way to think of equine metabolic syndrome, a lot of people will say it is similar to type 2 diabetes in humans. And I think that's maybe the best way. It is usually because of weight and because of inactivity, that your horse just isn't able to regulate some of those metabolic pathways that are regulated in a healthy horse. So we think of insulin and glucose and some of those things. So it is really something that tends to be caused by a horse that tends to be too heavy and not active. And unfortunately, a lot of horses with metabolic issue, we also tend to start to see issues with laminitis, insulin dysregulation, and those kinds of things. So again, that's probably the simplest way to think about it. But again, if you think your horse has that, please speak with your veterinarian because they have very good ways to diagnose if it truly is equine metabolic syndrome.
Excellent. Okay. So we are feeding alfalfa and Bermuda blend pellets to most of our livestock. How does this compare? The horse is getting alfalfa and supplements.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the pellets. I'm sure if it's working for you, great. Just know that horses do have that long, I don't know the size of the pellet, right? Just know that horses do have that long stemmed fiber requirement. So you'd want to try if they can eat, something that is long or stemmed, whether it's hay or pasture. But if they have been doing good on the pellet, keep doing it. If you're buying it in a bag, it should have a nutrient that bag will have the information on that feed tag of what it is.
Yeah, the pellets are kind of the larger pellet. That's not like the very fine. It's
Okay.
just compacted hay basically. So the first thing to add on to that is look at the feed label. Is it just strictly alfalfa and Bermuda, or are there added nutrients as well? Because like I said, a lot of the pellets here are not just the alfalfa, they're, like a complete equine or something like that. And so it's a way to travel with alfalfa, but
Sure.
also have the proper nutrients as well. I was looking somewhere, one of these things, we had a picture of the pellets, but another one. Okay, what about wall hay racks?
Wall hay racks?
Like up in the
You mean
corner
just-
of the stall or
Yeah.
hang-
So, there's a lot, and we've tried to get research funded and we just can't. There is a lot of interest in feeding height, right? The height you hang the hay net, the height you put up the rack. I like feeders. To me, I've never seen a horse have dental issues or chiropractic or back issues. I haven't seen any research that supports or dismisses those claims. And I think it's because when you watch a horse eat, when that horse is eating from that hay rack on the wall, it's grabbing a bite and then it is chewing at a height that is comfortable for them. They don't sit with their head up and chew. What do? They grab a bite, they lower their head and they chew. A lot of people will say horses must eat with their head down because that's the natural grazing position. I agree, but if you watch horses eat hay, what do? They grab a bite and they'll kind of just stick their head straight out and eat. So I'm a fan of any kind of feeder. And I'm sorry, I just don't have any research-based information to answer that question right now. And Dr. Green, maybe you know something that I don't know.
Well, and I mean, if you have some really dusty hay, of course, when they pull out from that hay rack, they're going to put dust into the air and they're going to be breathing it in. So there are things like that can be issues, but for the most part, yeah, the research is not necessarily there, but certainly as long as they're eating normally and not spending their time holding their head up, and as you said, they pull it and then eat it normally. I think you guys can see the picture. This is from the Blister Beetle article, and you can see the flake of alfalfa, the cubes, which is straight, just compacted alfalfa, and then on the right, that's the size of that's
Sure.
complete pellets without alfalfa base.
Yeah, and the nice thing about the pellets and the cubes is they're probably getting a very consistent diet. But again, I would just be a little concerned about that requirement for that long stem forage, with the only exception being that horse that does not have any teeth that must be fed a specific diet because of teeth.
Yeah, and that like for instance, our horses, for their that part of their diet, they're getting pellets in the morning and then hay at night.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have other questions? I've lost those screens because I was showing my Ashley Jeffers sample or Ashley Wright. Okay, here we go. We got some more in there. Go ahead, Ashley. You're right. There you go.
Okay, you have one that says she's watching this for her 4-H donkey And do these basic equine rules also apply for donkeys and burros?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are some special requirements for donkeys and burros, but the basic things that I have talked about are absolutely applicable to donkeys, burros, and mules. The only thing I would caution you is that that group of equines, that group of equids, tends to be pretty easy keepers. And we do tend to see a higher incidence of metabolic syndrome. For example, we tend to see fat pads over the withers, by the tail heads, you know. So I would just be more careful to keep a very healthy body weight on those donkeys and burros and mules. And I would say the same thing for ponies, right? Ponies tend to be easy keepers. So that would be the major difference. Dr. Green and I do have a colleague that specializes in that group of equids. It is definitely not me or her. But the basis apply, with the exception of just being really careful because they tend to be super easy keepers.
Okay, we also had a question about soaking hay. I always soak my hay. Is that okay? Do I need to replace anything that the soaking may deplete?
Yeah, so Dr. Green, you could Google University of Minnesota and hay soaking. That was one of the first studies I did when I went to the University of Minnesota. So we soaked immature alfalfa, mature alfalfa, immature orchard grass, which is a cool season grass, and mature orchard grass. And we soaked them for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, and then overnight. And there might have been some more times in between there. But we found that as long as you do not soak the hay for more than 60 minutes, you are not really losing anything that is of particular importance. If you are soaking hay for more than an hour, you are losing a substantial amount of dry matter. That is the amount that you're feeding. You are also losing a substantial amount of phosphorus. So you end up with an inverted calcium to phosphorus ratio. So if you are just soaking hay for the fun of it, usually people soak for a reason, right? They're soaking to reduce those water-soluble, non-structural carbohydrates. And you can soak out enough in the cool season grasses within 15 to 30 minutes. Legumes, alfalfa tends to be low enough where you don't have to soak them. If you have hay that is dusty, or you have a horse that is having issues with heaves or a breathing issue, you simply need to wet down the hay, like take a hose and wet it down. So I would never just soak the hay for the fun of it, because it's a lot of work and it's a huge mess. And in Minnesota, where I am, where it is currently negative 17 degrees, it freezes and you got a whole hot mess on your hands. So again, I'd want to know why you are soaking. Most people soak to remove those non-structural carbohydrates, nothing more than 60 minutes, never an overnight soak. That's when you run into a lot of problems with imbalances.
Okay, and I actually found the stablemanagement.com that has a bunch of your articles there. So I actually put that in the chat, like, because it has, well, it said it had soaking, but it has a bunch of different stuff, from purchasing large round bales to cooling horses, you name it. So what else? Did we get all of the questions? Oh, let's see. How do you feel about free feeding hay in a slow feeder? Basically keeping the feeder full all the time.
A lot of people do that. Really, that's kind of what round bales do, right? So what I would do is, I don't have a problem with that. The problem is some horses just become morbidly obese in that free feeding system. So the biggest thing you need to do is watch body condition score. And if your horses start getting a body condition score over 6, you're going to have to start to do something different, because we know that overweight horses, obese horses, we run into a lot of other problems. So there's really no issue with it as long as your horse doesn't become obese.
Okay, and then the question, what if you feed pellets in the morning and hay at night? Well, I mentioned that that's what ours do. But of course, the biggest thing is making
it's the full diet.
Yeah, just making sure you're
at it throughout the whole day.
Yeah. And then, of course, should I feed my horse grain? Well, it depends, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's the number one university professor answers. It depends. You want to, evaluate why are you feeding grain? If you're feeding grain because it makes you feel good, you need to evaluate your horse's nutrition plan. Is your horse need grain because it needs, so most horses receive grain because they need extra calories, or they need additional crude protein, or they need something additional. If they're just needing vitamins and minerals and their body condition is good and they're an easy keeper and they're not in a heavy work program, the ration balancers are much more affordable. They're fed in smaller amounts. Those are your vitamin and mineral mixes. Those are a better option. But if you have a senior horse, a performance horse, a hard keeping horse, a thoroughbred in race training, they obviously need more energy than what hay can provide. So grain is fine as long as you are feeding it for the correct purpose.
Okay, I think, oops, I see one other popped in and I was looking up your soaking hay article. What do you think about beet pulp?
I honestly don't know a lot about beet pulp. We haven't done any research projects with it. I'm not a nutritionist, so I don't work with it. I think in certain classes or certain scenarios, it works well. But again, I think that's a question that's better answered by an equine nutritionist.
Okay, so soaking your horse's hay. I think I finally found that one. It kind of jumped on me here. You know how sometimes they bait and switch with the links?
Yeah.
Excuse me. All right, so the soaking your horse's hay article is now in the chat. Ashley Jefford Sample, you want to share any last words?
Not that I can think of at the moment, but I do think that, even if you have a really great horse program, there's always ways to enhance it. And we're always willing to help you start a program or a project with InHorse. So just feel free to reach out. And if you're in Arizona, just contact your county agent and they'll contact us and we'll work with them to get things going.
Excellent. And then one last question, sunflower seeds for fat, ?
So that's not something that is on our radar. I haven't seen a lot of information on that. So you guys, you can feed horses all kinds of different stuff, right? But you really need to stick to the basics. The good quality forage, a vitamin and mineral mix or a ration balancer, and a bagged grain product from your favorite feed store, your favorite company, if needed. There's a lot of things you can feed horses. And again, it's just not my area of expertise, but I like to shy away from that stuff just because I don't know a lot about it and I don't know the potential repercussions. I don't know if it has a toxicity issue. I don't know the calcium to phosphorus. I don't know if it has micro minerals that is going to cause an imbalance. So I don't like to recommend that stuff.
Okay, and of course we got our last, this is the last one because we're past our time here. How do we keep our horses from eating too much? I think, didn't you answer that, Ashley, in the chat?
Well, there's a couple of strategies. Obviously, weigh your hay, know what you're feeding. We usually recommend starting out at feeding 2% body weight. If the horse is getting thin, you can bump it up to 2.5%. If the horse is getting overweight, bump it down to 1.75%, right? So restricting the amount they eat, using slow feed hay nets helps to limit feed them while controlling or extending the amount of time they're chewing and eating, keeping them busy. And if you have round bales and just a big old pasture, that gets a little harder. You need dry lots, you need grazing muzzles. So to restrict them, if you're feeding, large round bales, sometimes I see people put a little perimeter fence around the round bale and just fence them out for a couple hours, right? I mean, anything you can try to do to limit feed them. I'm sure you guys have other ideas too.
No, I think you got a good, just finishing a comment. See you on the next one here. I'm in the middle of a comment here. There you go. Okay, we got some good Eastern United States and New England folks on here too, so I gotta give them a shout out. So I think that we certainly want to thank Krishona and Ashley Jeff for Sample for talking to us about hay and preserving and choosing, and then also the great opportunities that we have in horse 4-H in Arizona as well. So thank you so much for a great webinar. And the speakers will stay on here, but we'll be back for sheep class in 2 weeks. So we are happy that you joined us, and we hope that you got some good information out of it.